Hi everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism, narcissistic abuse, and narcissistic relationships. A question I get all the time is, Dr. Ramani, please help me out to find a therapist who gets narcissistic abuse. So let's turn the paradigm around in this video. In this video, we're going to talk about some signs and red flags that you should pay attention to so you can avoid working with a problematic therapist or life coach when you are seeking help for narcissistic abuse. It is so important to find somebody you work with who is a good match, and so I'm hoping this video is helpful. The email I get all the time, and I've talked about this in various ways on this channel. So many people want to know how to find a good therapist or coach who gets this and can help me through this. More often than not, if you find someone good to work with on this, you know it. You may feel a sense of empathy from them, of being heard. You might even notice the progress that you're making in yourself. Well, here are some red flags that have come up over time that may signify someone who may not get it and may be resulting in more harm than good. Obviously, we know there's a power differential in any kind of therapeutic relationship. You're paying them for something, and they, as a therapist or a coach, are supposed to bring expertise through their education and licensure. Many people, especially survivors of narcissistic abuse, sometimes don't feel like they're allowed to question or walk away from a therapist where red flags are popping up. These may not necessarily even be bad therapists or unskilled therapists, but basically people who may not yet understand the specifics of narcissism and narcissistic abuse, and as such may be applying the wrong template to this group of clients who are experiencing these issues. The things I'm about to talk about are not an exhaustive list, and if you think there's any red flags I missed, please drop them in the comments. So red flag number 1 would be the therapist or the coach keeps using the two-way street model. Lots of relationship therapists fall back on this. Both of you in a relationship are responsible for what happened. Too many relationship therapy models are based on assumptions of equitability in the relationship, which we know is not true in a narcissistic relationship. The idea that these relationships are truly like two people, two-way street, shared responsibility, not so much if one person in the relationship claims to hold a monopoly on all of the reality in the relationship. When you are being gaslighted or manipulated, this idea of you're both responsible or the two-way street, it no longer applies. A therapist who understands narcissistic abuse, who hears your story, will recognize the patterns, and instead of saying, well, what's your part in this, will ask you how you feel and how you're coping with all of this. They'll ask you your history of being in relationships where reality is denied, and allow therapy or coaching to be a place where your reality is valid and not questioned with the implication that somehow you are responsible for your own abuse. Red flag number 2 is if the therapist or coach asks you why you didn't leave. Personally, I believe this is the most disrespectful question a survivor of any form of abuse, domestic abuse, emotional abuse, or narcissistic abuse can be asked, and shows an unawareness on the part of the therapist or coach about how trauma works or how narcissism works. Unfortunately, a lot of the motivational and coaching spaces are a lot of rah, rah, yes you can lead your own destiny and take back your life and just walk away. Not so fast. A balloon, yes, can rise and float away, but not if it's weighted down. A skilled therapist or coach will understand the patterns, the barriers, the narratives, and act as an empathic guide as you form a decision and grow into radical acceptance, whatever your choice is. To ask you why you didn't leave is shaming and doesn't use the traumatic framework, that sort of the trauma-informed framework that we must use to help survivors of narcissistic abuse. And it also doesn't account for the dangerous landscape of post-separation abuse. The fear of that often keeps people in these relationships. Number 3 red flag is when the therapist or coach pushes back when you use terms like narcissism or gaslighting. Survivors are smart. Back when I first started doing this work, nobody really talked about it that much, and now there are hundreds of books and blogs and thousands of sites online and many videos talking about it. Survivors are out there educating themselves. But unless you are going through it, you're not going to be the one looking at the content. The people looking at the content are the people who are experiencing this. A good therapist or coach should never shame a client for self-education or exploration, and instead will respect the client and ask them to share with them, maybe share the information or the books or videos that have been useful, what they've learned about their relationship from this content, and may even say, hey, maybe I should watch this video or read it myself. Many therapists and coaches will say things like, I don't like labels, or you shouldn't diagnose your partner or your family member. Shut it. Therapy is meant to be a safe space where you can use the language and say the things you need without judgment. Red flag number 4 is when you find your patterns are being pathologized and your issues, as it were, are being blamed for why the narcissist is lashing out. Many a therapist or coach has said, ugh, you're so anxious, you're being so mousy. Maybe that's why your partner's having such a hard time with you. Maybe if you relax, their behavior will improve. That's great. Blame the person's fallout of the narcissistic abuse for their narcissistic abuse. A person who understands narcissistic abuse will understand the cluster of symptoms and patterns that we observe in survivors of this kind of abuse. The rumination, the regret, the anxiety, the self-blame, the confusion, the helplessness, the powerlessness, the negative moods, the peacekeeping, the physical and the mental health challenges. And someone who gets it will never view what you're experiencing as the reason for the narcissistic abuse. Red flag number 5 is if a therapist or coach says, I'm really the only one who gets this, or I'm the best at this, or anything else grandiose like that. Believe it or not, some therapists and coaches can be grandiose. They might say things like, I'm the only one who gets this, I'm the best one, what I do works better than anyone else. A good therapist who's trauma-informed, well-educated on narcissistic abuse, who is empathic, where you feel safe and heard, and with whom you feel a good rapport, that's your best therapist for you. Listen, all of us therapists, we have a skill set, but we are replaceable. None of us have all the answers, right? When the therapist or coach makes it sound like they are the be-all, end-all, cure-all, greatest one ever, then that grandiosity definitely needs to be a red flag. Red flag number 6 is when the therapist or coach is over-focusing on forgiveness and bygones being bygones. You know I am not a fan of forgiveness, and least of all forgiving a narcissistic person, especially while you are still in it or coming out of it. This is a personal experience. Forgiveness is a personal experience. Some people never get there, some people do, and one outcome is not better than the other. But therapists and coaches who are over-focused on forgiveness as the only path forward for your own healing are missing the boat on how healing is inherent to you. It's not about letting the narcissistic person off the hook. Healing done right will get you to a place of indifference, of disconnection. And not even everyone doesn't always get there. It really depends on the nature of the narcissistic abuse in the relationship. When forgiveness or idiocy, like let bygones be bygones, comes up, there is a danger of therapy becoming a place of enabling. Red flag number 7 is when the therapist or coach gets so obsessed with, I can't diagnose someone I haven't met. And you end up feeling like you're the one who's being unkind by using this language. Some folks, some therapists will get caught in rigid rules like, well, you can't diagnose your partner or family member, or I can't speak about narcissism because I haven't met this person. That only leaves you not only doubting yourself, but perhaps wondering if you're unkind. That's not going to work here. I'm not going to get into all the thickets on narcissistic personality disorder versus narcissism and on and on. Narcissism is a descriptive term that describes a personality style. And if someone talks to me about someone who lacks empathy and is entitled and arrogant and grandiose and validation seeking and manipulative, I'll say, those patterns definitely sound like narcissism. Okay? Those patterns sound like narcissism. That's not a diagnosis, that's a damned observation. But when a coach or therapist keeps berating you for using labels that are shaming, and that's a shaming experience for you, and it misses the opportunity for education and healing. Number 8 red flag is if they upsell you more and more. One of the reasons I don't like going to my annual dentist visits is the upsell. When I'm in a clinical situation, I don't like being told that you can add this or that for more money. I'm trying to imagine being in a hospital and then I'm in the operating room and being upsold the platinum appendectomy versus the standard model. I truly believe upselling does not belong in any form of clinical care. It's my opinion, I stick by it. When therapists or coaches upsell services that may be beyond your financial reach and make it sound like this is the only path forward, the best path forward, that can be coercive. In psychology, my profession at least, we have ethical guidelines that require a good faith estimate of what therapy should cost you. It's an estimate. But a therapist may say, listen, if we work together weekly for 6 months and address your most acute issues, it's going to cost this much, or insurance should cover this much. You got to be careful because there are no shortcuts. It's hard work, putting your head down, getting education, doing the work, journaling, and other mindfulness-oriented activities. But this idea of like, if you do it this way or that way and spend all this extra money, it's going to be better. That doesn't really belong in this kind of therapeutic practice. Red flag 9 is something I call proselytizing. Sometimes some therapists and coaches are acolytes of other leaders. These are often spiritual gurus and new age icons. They may even have pictures of these people they follow in their office or on their website. Or they're also maybe therapists and coaches really plugged into traditional organized religion. I am personally, against my bias, I'm a fan of secular therapy where we separate the two. But I want you to be wary of any coach or therapist who's encouraging you to show up to meetings outside of therapy that are related to the person they're a follower of or that are making big metaphysical promises. Therapy is therapy. Therapists may make recommendations as to other professionals like a psychiatrist or nutritionist. They may check in, for example, on how 12-step meetings you're going to are working or on your sobriety. They may suggest group therapy as an adjunct to your therapy, or they may recommend books or videos. But they are not supposed to be spaces suggesting where you show up at some sort of strange spiritual meeting that they're going to be at as well, or that might make time or financial demands on you. Final one, and the tough one is, has the therapist or coach been through it? This last one is tough. Is it important that the therapist or coach has been through it? Listen, I have no history of addiction, but I have worked with many clients living with addiction. I have no history of several other things, but I work with those clients with those histories. I do have a history of narcissistic abuse, and I work with those clients. That said, I have had clients, for example, with histories of addiction, who will stop and say, you know, Dr. Ramani, you don't actually really understand the craving for that first drink in the morning. And I acknowledge I don't. And I also will tell them, I also understand, like, I get it and I hear you. And if it feels safer for you to work with someone who has that lived experience, I get that too. Narcissistic abuse is a funny one because it's still a new area that's still not acknowledged by many practitioners. Again, having been through it definitely can create an empathy and an awareness that leaves a client not feeling crazy. However, I do not believe that a person must have had a history of narcissistic abuse to be able to do good work with the survivor. The therapist simply needs to approach this from a trauma-informed framework, willing to be present and non-judgmental, and be willing to get training or consultation or supervision on narcissistic abuse. Also, not all therapists are ever going to be transparent about their lived experience, so you simply may not know whether or not they've been through it. I know there's red flags here on things you may want to avoid here that I didn't hit, and some of these red flags I listed here, some of them may not stop someone from being a good therapist for you. Maybe the simplest guidance is that if you feel invalidated in therapy, talk about it and bring it up. If the therapist becomes defensive or shaming, then it's time to find someone new. If, however, you're able to work through that impasse, I still think there's a possibility in that therapy. Therapy for narcissistic abuse survivors is so important. People often enter therapy so confused and self-blaming that having someone who gets it and will not double down on the self-blame and self-doubt and confusion is absolutely essential. Even though a lot of survivors don't feel great about their instincts, your instincts are probably really on point. You've just always talked yourself out of them. It's okay if a therapist or coach doesn't feel like a good match. The reason you're in this space is oftentimes because you were not willing to be kind with yourself and listen to yourself. Let this be the place you do. If the therapist's feelings are hurt, then that therapist needs to go do some work on themselves. It's the nature of the game. Not every therapist or coach is an ideal match for a client, but some of these red flags specific to the narcissistic abuse space, pay attention to them and make sure you find a safe space to do this work. Thanks again.